JavaScript variables. It's good practice when programming to write code that is as generalizable as possible. It allows the code to be reused and helps limit the effort of writing and maintaining redundant code. Imagine somebody gave you a robot as a gift to do chores around your house. You have to teach it how to do your chores. What if you wanted to teach it to wash the dishes? That would be great. It'd be really helpful to have a robot wash the dishes for you. But what if you had to write different instructions for each dish in your house? That would be a lot of dishes and perhaps a lot of instructions, and that wouldn't be so great. What we can do with the variable is that we can treat it as like a container, and then we can write a set of directions and pass each item through that set of directions. So here in this diagram, currently, we're going to rinse the food off the silverware and then wash the silverware with soap and water, and then dry the silverware with a towel, and then move on to the next thing, which perhaps might be a cup. The box, the red box that you see here, is really the variable. It's a temporary container that we can pass these items through, and we can teach our robot to wash all of the items one at a time using this container. And that will make your instructions more modular and more reusable. And that's really helpful. There are many ways of declaring a variable in JavaScript. We'll start with one of the most basic ways, which is using the var keyword, var. So here, I have a variable called x I'm creating, and JavaScript will then recognize x as a variable, and I'm assigning it an empty string, 2 sets of quote marks there, followed by a semicolon. And that means that variable x holds an empty string. On the next example, I have a variable called cheese that I've created, and it's holding a string called yummy. The equal sign here is an assignment operator. It means assigned. So yummy is assigned to cheese. It's easy to use the word equals because we're used to seeing the symbol in association with math, where we see 2 + 2 = 4, and we say equals. But in programming, we want to say assigned. Yummy is assigned to cheese. And then the next example, we have a variable called age, and it's assigned a value of 25. 25 is a number. It doesn't need to go inside quotes because JavaScript knows what a 25 is. In JavaScript, variables are case sensitive and they have to follow certain rules. For example, a variable has to start with a letter. You can't start with a number. So this variable over here that says 1 cat is not going to work because it starts with a number. Also, you should not start variables with something like a $sign. They're used a lot by libraries, so you should not do that as well. The third example, my-cat, is not going to work because JavaScript sees the dash as a minus sign. So it thinks you're trying to subtract cat from my, which is not going to work at all either. Also, you can't have a space in a variable name because var my might be a variable, but then it doesn't know what to do with cat because it sees that as a separate thing because there's a space in there. And then finally, there are certain keywords in JavaScript that you can't use as names of variables, like new is a keyword. And over here, I have some of the keywords pulled up on the W3 Schools website. W3 Schools is one of the places you can go to get a lot of information about JavaScript, basic information. We'll also look a lot at the MDN, the Mozilla Developer Network, which is really the most authoritative place to get information about JavaScript, but it can be a little bit overwhelming at first as well. But the W3 Schools is a little bit easier to understand. You can see here that there are a bunch of keywords, and you'll notice that some of them have an asterisk in here. Words marked with an asterisk are new in ECMAScript 5 and 6. Remember, we talked about the versions of JavaScript. So now when you see ECMAScript 5 and 6, you know that we're talking about ECMAScript 5, which was released in 2009. That was the big release then. And ECMAScript 6, or ES6, was the version that was released in 2015. Okay, so these are all keywords that you can't use as names for variables in JavaScript. Over on the right in this image here, you'll see we have variable cat with a lowercase c, variable cat all in uppercase letters, and variable cat with a capital C. These are three different variables that hold three different values. It's generally better practice to use lowercase letters when creating variables, or to do what's called camel casing, like we have down at the bottom here. My cat with a capital C in the middle. So it's kind of like a hump in the middle. We like camels in JavaScript. So that's called camel casing. That's not specific to JavaScript, but it's something that is in a lot of programming languages. But we use that frequently in JavaScript. You'll frequently see variables that are using camel casing. We've been talking long enough about JavaScript, so now it's time to actually get down and write some. And I hope you're ready to do that, because it's pretty exciting to start seeing it come alive on web pages. And it'll be a little while before we start making really interesting things, but we'll be working with the basics now. So let's get started with that. And what we can do with our browser is we can actually open just a new browser tab and use the console to write some JavaScript. Because JavaScript is native to the browser, we can write it right into the browser and it'll actually do stuff in the browser. So that's pretty cool. So I have a new tab over here, and you can create a new tab for yourself. And I'm just going to right click and choose inspect. And you have to right click on the white area. You can't right click on an element or something like that. But right click on the white area and choose inspect. And that'll bring up the inspector in Chrome. And again, I'm in Chrome. And when I do that, it might put the inspector over here. It might do some different kinds of things. Some different buttons might be selected. But what you can do is you can use these buttons here. You can arrange this thing, make it bigger or smaller. You can use these buttons to move this inspector around. So this button here will allow me to choose where I want it to display. Right now it's on the right, but I could put it on the left, or I could put it on the bottom. I want it on the bottom in this case. Sometimes it's helpful to tear it off entirely into a different window, which is this icon, but I'm going to leave it down here on the bottom. And then I want to close this thing down here because that's just giving me some information. And I'm going to make this come up here. And right now I'm on the Elements tab, and I can see the HTML that is making up this page. And you can actually drag around on here, and you'll see different elements of the page will get highlighted. But what I really want to do to write some JavaScript is the console. So click on the console, and you'll see if there are any errors coming up or anything like that. And this is something coming over from Google right now. There's some sort of error here, and I don't really care about that. So I'm going to click on this little clear console button here to clear the console and get rid of that error. And now I can do things like create a variable. Bar cheese equals yummy. And again, yummy is assigned to cheese, the variable cheese here. Put a semicolon and press enter. Now, before I do this, another thing that's useful is if this is seeming very small on your screen, you can use Control or on Windows or Command on the Mac and plus the plus key to make the text larger, or the minus key to make it smaller, plus and minus, or you can do Command 0 to put it back to the default size. So a lot of times when I'm working with students, they have trouble seeing the syntax, and I recommend making the actual code larger so that you can see it better. So I'm going to make it larger like that. So var cheese equals yummy. Great. Undefined is sort of the return value. This doesn't have a return value. I'm just assigning a variable here. So don't worry about the fact that it says undefined here. Now that I've defined this variable, if I type cheese, you'll see that I get yummy. That comes back. That's the return value for that variable name. I'm going to make a new variable, my num, and assign it a value of 5. And I get a 5 back that returns the value of 5. So I could make another variable. When I created my num, you'll notice I forgot to use the var keyword, and that's fine. JavaScript will adjust for that in this case, and we'll talk later about what happens when you don't use the var keyword. But in this case, it's fine. It actually created a variable called my num and assigned it 5. But it would be better to use the var keyword, var my other num equals 6. That comes back undefined. And this came back with 5 because of the fact that I didn't use the var keyword. But if I do my num, you'll see I'll still get 5. If I do my other num, and you'll notice that in Chrome, it's predicting what I'm going to type. And if I press tab on the keyboard, I don't even have to type that whole thing. I can do something like var sum equals my num plus my other num. And I can even pick it from the list using my keyboard here. So I don't even have to type it. Now, if I do sum, you'll notice I get an 11 because it's doing basic arithmetic. I can also use a method called console.log. Console.log. And I could do my num times my other num. Oops. Semicolon. And you'll notice that I get 30 because it's taken 5 and multiplied it by 6. Now we're in the console, so we don't have to use the console.log statement here, the console.log method, but because I can just do my num times my other num, this one here. And you'll see I still get 30. But I'm showing you the console.log method because when we start working with files, we'll use this method a lot to send things to this console. While I'm in the console, I don't actually need to use it. Here you can see I've cleared out the console by clicking this clear thing here. That won't actually forget any of the code that you've put. If you do want to actually forget the variables, you can click the refresh button up here, and that will actually forget everything. Now I'm getting the error that came back just with the Google page, but I can clear that here. So I can actually create variables fresh that way. So use this refresh button if you really want to clear out what your code remembers. So now if I were to type cheese, it'll tell me that it doesn't have cheese as defined anymore because I refreshed the page. But let's do this. I'm going to make a variable var not num. I'm going to assign it a value of 5, but I'm putting it in quotes because it's not really a number. It's a string with a number in it. And I could make another variable, var new num. I'm going to assign it a value of 10. So that's it. That's actually a number. Now watch this. If I do new num plus not num, it gives me a 105 inside quotes. Now, JavaScript is loosely typed. You do not have to specify what type of data a variable is going to hold when you create the variable. And a lot of people don't like that about JavaScript. And way back in the day, when they were working on ECMAScript 4, you'll remember that version was never released. They were thinking seriously about switching JavaScript to being a more strongly typed language, like other languages, where you have to declare what type of data a particular variable will hold when you create the variable. But in JavaScript, you don't have to do that. And Douglas Crockford, who we mentioned earlier, made a strong argument that the loosely typed nature of JavaScript is actually very expressive and very powerful in its own way if you know how to use it properly. But it can lead to confusion. And here's a good example of that, where we might get something that we don't expect. Perhaps we expected to add 10 to 5 and get 15, but instead we got 105 in a string. So that's kind of an important distinction and something important to understand about the way JavaScript works. Another thing to note is that the plus operator in JavaScript does double duty. It will add numbers together, so we could make another variable, var new num2, and assign it a value of 6. And then I could do new num plus new num2, and it'll give me 16. So it'll add numbers together, but it will also concatenate strings. So here we were seeing the plus sign actually doing some concatenating because one of those elements was a string. So it concatenated it together, and I got 105. And down here, when we use the plus sign, it's actually adding. This is a problem in JavaScript, and they've done some things in the language to help mitigate the fact that the plus sign does both things. But, and we'll look at what we can do to deal with that. We'll look at some better ways of putting strings together other than using the plus sign. But these features of JavaScript that were built in from the beginning persist to this day. And the plus sign still does two things. It concatenates and it adds. So here we're seeing already very much at the beginning of the course things about JavaScript that are a little bit different. We're seeing that it is a loosely typed language, and that's unusual. We're also seeing that the plus sign does double duty, and that's not only unusual, but a little bit problematic. And so already you're learning a little bit about why we use JavaScript in certain ways, or why we type it in certain ways. And we'll get into more detail about that as we go along. I'm going to clear out my console here. Press the clear button there. And then I'm going to create a new variable, var my num equals 10. Sure, we'll put that in there. And then I'm going to make another variable, var my num as string. I'm going to make a variable there and we'll call it 5. But that variable, again, is a string. Now, it's important to note that even though JavaScript is loosely typed, it doesn't mean that variables don't have a type. So if I do type of, which is a method that allows me to pass in a variable like my num, it'll tell me that it is in fact a number. Whereas if I do type of my num is string. I can actually pick it from the list here so I don't have to type the whole thing. It'll tell me that's a string. If I make a variable var undefined variable and leave it empty, so there's nothing in here, I could do type of undefined variable to get my variable here. And you'll see that I get undefined. Or I could do var nothing at all and assign it null. And I could do type of nothing at all. And I get object. So that's kind of interesting. So these are all very different variables with different values. And that's an important thing to understand about JavaScript, but they do have type associated with them. Let's try one more. I'm going to make another variable, var empty string. And I'm going to assign it a couple of quotes. And if I do type of empty string, you'll see even though there's nothing in there, there's nothing really assigned to this variable, the fact that I put a pair of quotes there means that it is, in fact, a string. It's also kind of important to note that I could use single quotes or double quotes in JavaScript. They do the same thing. So it doesn't really matter if you use single quotes or double quotes at all. Now, if you want to find out more about the type of method, you could come over here and just Google JavaScript type of. And the MDN will come up very quickly, if not the first. Sometimes you'll get W3 schools. The MDN, which is the Mozilla Developer Network, is the definitive resource for web technology such as HTML and CSS. And will give you a lot of information about different methods and different things you can use. And we'll be referring a lot to the MDN throughout this course, sometimes the W3 Schools website as well. But the MDN really is sort of the definitive resource, but it can be a little bit confusing at first. So sometimes the W3 Schools website's a little bit easier to understand, but the MDN is very thorough. Okay, so that gives us kind of a very basic start at creating some variables that can hold different pieces of data. And at this point, you're probably wondering, yeah, so what? But remember that as we're learning a language, right now we're just learning the alphabet. And the letters by themselves don't really do all that much. It's not until you start putting them together to form words that can start to have meaning. So we'll be working on some more of these very basic elements of JavaScript. But then pretty quickly, we're going to be getting into more interesting aspects of the language, and you'll be creating more interesting little programs that will actually do things on web pages and on websites.